Happily joining us today is Joe Trotter, American Legislative Exchange Council's Task Force Director for the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force. Joe, how you doing today? Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, life is good, my man. Happy to talk energy. Happy to talk with CEN. Y'all are one of my favorites.
Well, good. We hope to stay that way. Hopefully this interview doesn't deter that. So, Joe, I was hoping you could give us and the listeners a big overview of ALEC. What is done at ALEC? What is the purpose of ALEC? And what is your role and the subsequent duties therein?
So ALEC is basically a forum where we bring together elected state leaders, representatives, delegates, state senators from across the country. And it's a forum for where we all talk about ideas. What has worked in your state? What did not work in your state? What needs to be changed? We also have private sector members who get in on the conversation so that they can go ahead and say, well, look, here's what is realistically possible for our industry. Here's what won't work. Here's what will work. And so it's just a giant conversation, basically, about what ideas should be spread on the state and local level. And what we do is we have a model policy process where a state legislator has an idea, again, something that's worked in their state, and they think it might be good for the rest of the country. They come to ALEC, they send it to us, and they submit it as a proposed model policy. And then we go ahead, we have some meetings about it. We do have a subcommittee meeting about energy, one about environment, one about agriculture. And ALEC really does this across all kinds of stuff. The EEA task force is one of 10 task forces. So it goes through the subcommittee process. It goes to a full task force vote. And the members vote on whether they think it's a good idea, a bad idea, or whether it needs to be changed. And there's a whole amendment process. After that, let's say that a proposed model policy makes it through the task force. It goes up to ALEC's board of directors, where they go ahead and say, this works, this doesn't work, or whether there are concerns, it can be returned to the task force. But if the board gives its stamp of approval, we go ahead and put up, essentially just leave up, because we publicly display all of our draft model policies before they become an official ALEC model policy. And once it's up and endorsed by the board, state legislators can take it, modify it, use it wholesale, take some ideas, basically go ahead and say, this worked in other states. It's a trusted policy solution. It's gone through the ALEC process. And we really don't just rubber stamp these proposed model legislation. It's when it has the ALEC stamp, it's really gone through a very intensive review process. You've had hundreds of eyes on it. You've had just all sorts of players from different governments, different levels of government weighing in on it. So when something has gone through the ALEC model policy process, it is a trusted policy solution at that point. So that's basically what it does. Now, me personally, I run the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force. My background educationally is in environmental science. It's working for ALEC was truly a dream come true. It was the seventh time I applied here. I finally got the job. So,
wow.
Yeah, over the course of a decade. So beyond that, in addition to guiding that model policy process, if one of our members has a question or wants to bounce policy ideas off of somebody, state legislators don't generally have a ton of staff. And so they can come to me about an EEA topic, and I'll let them know if there's sort of anything they're missing or things like that, just sort of to augment the ability of state legislators to get their job done. And state legislators are just some of the coolest folks. It's not generally a full-time legislature, although there are full-time. They're people who really, really care about their communities and take time off work and away from their families to go ahead and make their state better. So it is such an honor to work with these folks. And that's basically what ALEC does.
So one of your other, responsibilities seems to be also aiding in some of the educational projects and academic projects that you guys put forward, such as the third edition of your energy report that I saw came out a couple of months back now.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So we do some reports too. And even the direction of the reports are based off of model policy ideas. So we decided to take a look at energy affordability. And in this edition, we looked at electricity, gasoline, diesel, the main drivers of modern infrastructure. Within that, we looked at prices themselves first and foremost. And then we also took a look at basically several different policy ideas that have percolated through the states, things like renewable portfolio standards, carbon taxes, things like that. And just sort of said, hey, this is the price. These are the policies that are enacted or not enacted, and let the chips fall as they were. And I'm actually working on the fourth edition already, which is going to take a big look at reliability and what the energy generation mix is. I'm sure we're going to get into that later to see how all of that impacts affordability as well. So there is definitely an educational component too.
Yeah, that's going to be really timely, I think, especially as a lot of reports that I'm reading are finding that transmission lines, transmission reliability, supporting mechanisms are kind of reaching the end of their lifespan. An investment in not only making sure that we're not finding faults within our existing lines, but also developing new ones to meet load growth, which seems to be skyrocketing due to domestic industry, manufacturing, and data centers and the like. So that's going to be a very interesting report that I'm going to be very excited to read. So thank you for producing that.
So actually,
Yeah.
something on that's very interesting, and this is just kind of how the interaction between the actual infrastructure and environment. There's so much overlap in this topic. One of the new problems that the industry is having right now, when we say load, we're generally talking about base load power, things like that, the amount of electricity that's coming through. Well, we're now at the point where these lines are becoming so heavy that they actually have to get bigger poles to hold the lines up.
Oh my gosh.
And there's a growing shortage of trees big enough to do that. So it's absolutely crazy.
What a weirdly niche issue that has to be overcome within the planning process and like infrastructure development and investment. I mean, can you imagine like a line item in a public policy document that calls for more sturdy poles? We have to invest another, $100,000 in sturdy poles. I mean, but that's really, I mean, when you get down to the nitty gritty, those are the kind of issues that actually force a lot of the cost on the both ratepayers and I guess utilities themselves.
Yeah, and I mean literally the line item when you break it down out of its class double A hardwood or whatever, it really boils down to we're having a slight shortage of freakishly large trees. That's an actual problem with the industry right now.
It really is wild that the kinds of things that are going to become problems or that have to be addressed. So, well, let's take a deeper dive into your third edition of your energy report. You take a focused look at mandated energy policies and their effects. In states that allow for the free market and voluntary engagement in those goals, and the goals of the mandates, I should say, did you see better economic outcomes where there was a sense of the state to meet the same goals that the mandates levied, but doing so in the way that generates free market, that allows for innovation to flourish?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of electricity pricing, states where they had the freedom to go ahead and sort of allow the market to take control, you had lower energy costs. And the interesting thing is, in a lot of cases, you still see basically these dream technology standards happening voluntarily through the market. There are places in this country where the wind blows so reliably, so often, that you're seeing huge increases in terms of things like the windmills and wind generation. And it's not just a government, you must do it. It's the market going ahead and saying, hey, this is the most cost effective way to do it. And then if something does go wrong, these same states generally have, again, because free market allows people to go ahead and build whatever infrastructure they want, there are backups if for some reason the wind is not working quite as well that particular day. And so you're seeing lower energy costs, you're seeing just generally essentially better outcomes for states where this is happening versus some areas where, doesn't necessarily make as much sense, but there's this absolute mandate it needs to happen.
Right. And I just feel like it's so often seen the benefits that the free market can provide versus the turmoil that mandates create, right? When the government really wants to stick its hand in and pick the winners and losers, you start having a lot more problems than you would have otherwise had within the development of new energy generation as well as reliability standards. So, jumping into the energy costs within states that are utilizing clean energy options, comparing those states with the states that haven't employed clean energy options, are we seeing a larger difference in cost to the ratepayers?
It is so extremely state specific. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. But look, again, one of the beauty of our federalist system and one of the problems with our country being so geographically large, certain answers to these problems make sense in one place and not so much in another. If you take a look at, say, like Arizona, huge amounts of land, not all of it necessarily quite as arable, things like that, it makes a lot more sense to have a much higher portion of, say, like solar
Mhm.
versus upstate New York, where basically some industrial scale solar facilities up there, you've got much longer winters and like much higher cloud cover. So in some states, again, certain things just make more sense and the market seems to work perfectly fine. But in states where they're trying to essentially ram these not great solutions down the ratepayers' throats, it's not going so well. And one of the things I'm finding as I'm working on the next edition, which I am going to be so happy when this comes out, is the freedom to make the choice, the freedom to say, yes, I want the solar panel on the roof. Yes, I want a windmill on my property. Yes, I'd like access to natural gas. There's like a budding love affair with nuclear going on right now, things like that. States where you have the choice, when one particular option isn't working out economically, take a look at, say, like 2022, for example. There was a huge, huge spike in the price of natural gas. Well, free market in comparison, other generation technologies, solar, wind, hydro, were suddenly way less expensive than natural gas. And so those savings were passed on to consumers. You were sort of nailed down to one or two options. If one option suddenly went up significantly and there was no other way to generate electricity, their rates skyrocketed too. So the freedom to make energy choices means so much to keeping the grid reliable and affordable.
Yeah, one of the things we're seeing a lot as we do our community solar engagement is the interest in the freedom of choice from the individual ratepayer and consumer. It is such a burden of relief, I guess, a relief of burden, I should say, for ratepayers to be able to say, well, yeah, if there's a solar field, a solar array just down the street that I could subscribe to and get power from, maybe I do want that. Well, or I'm a renter and I can't get solar panels put on the roof because the landlord didn't want them, but I do kind of want to benefit from the lower cost of solar. Maybe I'll subscribe to one of the arrays in the neighborhood. Right? That to me is just so profoundly in line with conservative thinking, in that the individual gets to make the choice. Period. Right? And that I think is something that, as we continue to promote, is going to find more conservatives getting on board with clean energy options.
And in addition to that, like all of that, 100% on board. But one of the things I love about community solar that just makes it such a unique, interesting concept that's good for the country, at least in my opinion, is community solar does such a great job at distributing the geographic location of where generating facilities happen. So if something happens to, the one power plant in the area, basically community solar can go ahead and pick up the slack for that neighborhood, that community. And as we head into like this fun little AI future that we're starting to live in, and you've got, bad actors across the world that have this increased cyber ability to mess with the electric grid, having this distributed generation, it's not just good for the clean energy perspective, it's also just fantastic in terms of national security and just keeping the lights on if anything were to happen. I can't stress enough at how like beneficial that is to have that option deployed.
Yeah, the national security element of this conversation is something that I often don't hear talked about nearly enough in regards to why clean energy could be a very beneficial and secure option for the country to employ. So I am fully on board with that reasoning as well. Um, I'll move on a little bit to some of the model policies you guys have been working on at ALEC. I'm curious, in recent years, so you've been there now 2 or 3 now, Joe, is that correct?
A little over two.
A little over two. If you had to highlight a model policy or a couple model policies that you're just very proud of that you think are effective that have come out of your task force, are there any that come jump into mind?
So we're seeing a lot of movement on things like infrastructure security and making it so that people who mess with the electric grid and mess with basically all the switching equipment that goes into it, messing with this just incredibly critical infrastructure is taken a lot more seriously than it has been in the past. And it's great because as we're seeing, solar fields come up and we're seeing the wind farms come up, people messing with those options needs to be taken very seriously. There have been incidents across the country where it's been everything from kids thinking that they're playing a prank that winds out taking out a whole county's worth of power to some slightly crazier stories. I think it was either Oregon or Washington. A couple of guys were decided to rob a bank, so the first thing they did was pull the power at the switching station, which again took out the whole county. Taking that threat more seriously is huge. But also, we have model policy that essentially calls for energy choice freedom. Now, it's saying consumers know what they want and can choose what they want. It's not always going to be perfect, but instead of coming from a top down mandate, state governments can basically say, let the market decide. The states that have adopted that, and I'm looking at, Wyoming, South Dakota, places like that have seen dramatically lower energy bills. And leaving that choice up to consumers, up to the market, it leaves people with better options and, frankly, better reliability. So those are two huge ones that are great. We also, and this is maybe not as much energy, but we, ALEC and our partners have taken a look at what's happened out west with wildfires. And on its face, that doesn't seem like it would be something so much in the energy space. But one of the biggest problems with wildfires is they go ahead and they take out energy infrastructure as it sweeps through areas. So when states say, why, yes, you don't need 16 different permits to go through and clear out the dead timber underneath the easements near power lines, all of that is contributing towards making sure that the grid stays more reliable and the lights stay on. So those are some of the ones I'm particularly proud of right now.
Yeah, they sound great in terms of addressing the issue of what can happen to the transmission lines. Like, take out of the equation, we need new transmission lines. Take out of the equation, there's new technology that could be added to the transmission lines. Take all of that out. How are they staying up? How are they not, breaking? Did someone ram a car into one? How much did that take out? Are the birds? I mean, I read an article recently where too many birds on a line are creating too much weight and causing problems. How are you dealing with that, right? All of those things are questions that do have to be answered because they affect.
That's why they need the freakishly large trees now.
That's what. Yeah, yeah. Well. I hope a biochemist and engineer is hard at work building the more resilient tree line, right? That's what we need. Since you've moved over to the environmental side, I'll ask, with the timeliness of the farm bill under consideration at the national level, have you seen anything in the Forum of Innovation and Ideas that you get to host year round? Are you seeing new technology or clean energy policies affecting farmers and agriculture in ways that are meaningful?
So it's interesting, and I here at ALEC I talk about this a lot. There's sort of several debates that are going on in this space. One of the big ones is natural gas considered clean or not? And ALEC takes no particular position either way. We don't have model policy on it, but how that plays out when it comes to agriculture is very interesting because most folks don't realize that the vast majority of fertilizer is produced as a product of natural gas. So it is one of the most significant inputs in there. So the debate on energy with natural gas also relates to basically the agriculture side of things. So when folks come down hard on natural gas and say, oh, it's just this awful pollutant, what's not being taken into account is it is the primary feedstock that goes into fertilizer. Well, without fertilizer, the way we produce it in the modern sense, you're not going to get food. If you're not getting food, it's going to be a real problem, both here and abroad. So that was actually one of the interesting things that happened. It completely tied into the energy freedom of choice with the states that had alternatives to natural gas when things spiked over in Russia and Ukraine, because that region that is mostly contested in Ukraine and Russia right now was one of the largest areas in terms of fertilizer production in the world. So we had the cost of natural gas going up. We also had one of the largest fertilizer producing regions go down essentially overnight. So we saw squeezes in the ag sector. We saw it in the energy sector. There's this whole interplay between the two, ag and energy, and how it relates to food security, global commodities. It was kind of a disaster in the making. And it looks like we've headed that off to some extent. But it's been interesting on more of a directly agricultural land use for certain things. We've seen, and this is not just an ALEC thing. I worked in the conservation space before all this. Farmers have parts of their land that are just straight up unusable. And it was heartening to see those areas get used for things like small wind farms or solar areas where it was essentially dead, unproductive space. And when I say dead, I mean literally things could not grow there. Giving farmers this additional cushion, it not only helps them, but it helps the food markets overall. Because it winds up with the federal government and state governments having to spend less on subsidization, especially in bad years when these farmers are able to utilize space that would otherwise essentially go to waste in terms of at least a beneficial human impact. Having those areas get used is just fantastic on all accounts.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see more ideas and innovation for policy come from that overlap between energy and agriculture. So I'm glad we got to take a second to talk about that before we've come up on time. So, Joe, I really want to thank you for being here. This has been a very interesting conversation, and I certainly hope you'll come back and join us again on the Conservative Energy Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much for your time, Joe, and we'll catch you next time.